of the United Nations without something preceding it or succeeding it. So you'll always find prevention of genocide, prevention of violent extremism, prevention of this, prevention of that. Just like peace, the aspiration of prevention tends to be defined negatively. It's by the absence of something. There are many other reasons, but this is one principal one. But there are hopeful signs that perhaps prevention is about to be liberated from this ubiquitous, inseparable companion. And some of these signs have been mentioned in the previous sessions. So as prevention is not simply a security or a peace and security matter, but also as a function of sustainable development and effective governance. One such change is a steady conceptual shift from preventing conflict to sustaining positive peace. This is launched in the 60s by the Norwegian called Johan Galtung, and now being consolidated in innovative and practical ways by thought leaders and peace entrepreneurs, such as this gentleman to my left, and as you will soon discover. The second development that bodes well for the use of prevention at earlier stages before the conflict is the unanimous adoption last September by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, a new global framework that has replaced the previous one that ended up in 2015. And throughout this agenda, comprising, as you probably know, of 17 independent goals, peace is a cross-cutting theme that the signatories committed to, and they signed a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity that also seeks to strengthen universal peace in larger freedom. The preamble part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Peace, Sustainable Development has 5 Ps, which I just mentioned. And they are intimately interconnected: people, planet, peace, and prosperity. Goal 16, as you may have heard, is particularly dedicated to the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, the provision of access to justice for all, and building of effective, accountable institutions at all levels. If you're looking for a definition for an effective governance, don't look any further. And if you want to be even further enriched, look at the 12 targets that have been agreed under this particular goal. And it's essentially about building accountable states and state institutions, building trust and earning legitimacy. And given that much of the ills that afflict our societies are the results of egregious deficits in all these areas, it is no wonder that this framework has been hailed as a universal aspirational agenda where early prevention can find an uncontested home. The second development that gives hope for prevention as an early action is the Sustaining Peace Framework, which has been mentioned earlier. I will not go through that. Perhaps I can elaborate on this, why this resolution that was adopted last April by the Security Council and the General Assembly simultaneously is truly a landmark resolution, where the action, where conflict is not the starting point, where the starting point is not the causes or the factors that drive and sustain conflict, but the starting point is the factors that drive and sustain peace. So what I would like to do now is, what does that mean? And I'm going to take you on a flight. I don't know if you've heard Icarus. How many of you have heard of Icarus? Wonderful. This is a perilous journey that I'm going to invite you to join me in. I would like you, as much as possible, to hold judgment and suspend certainty, even though you see, as I am trying to fly, I'm about to crash and perhaps plunge to my doom. But I have a plan. It's a flight plan that has 4 constituent parts. The first one is reconnaissance, a reconnaissance of the terrain, an analysis of the terrain over which I'll be flying and possibly land. That means that I will be looking, in addition to understanding the key sources of vulnerabilities and fragility of a particular situation, I must be on the lookout for sources of resilience that exist at different levels of social organization, from the family to the state. These may be physical assets that people possess. They may be norms on which social relations are ordered, or networks through which information is disseminated. Why do I need to look out for those? Simply because people tend to resort to these capacities in times of national stress and threats in order to survive, to stay afloat. When I was helping negotiate a ceasefire agreement between the government of Central African Republic and a whole army that mutinied, and all of a sudden the president didn't have any army, basically, I wanted to understand how to approach this problem, because they've told me that women have an insight on how this can be done. And of course, as an outsider, we expect the leadership of women to always be visible, to always be public, until I started listening to women, not with the intent to solve, but with the intent to understand. And I realized there is so much that we have missed in previous attempts, because we looked at the world from the high tower of our own village with the wrong lenses about what gender meant in Central African Republic. So that's the first part of this flight plan. In other words, I want to understand that what I will propose as a contribution will build on what people know or where they are, rather than on what I think is needed. Second, I will use the ongoing design of national plans for the implementation of the SDGs that are ongoing, as you know, as well as the overarching vision of sustaining peace, as legitimate entry points to empower and support governments and their national partners to integrate prevention as an explicit added value, in addition to the intrinsic economic, social dividends that the goals are meant to provide. So what does that mean? It means ensuring that development priorities leave no one behind, It means putting in place meaningful everyday mechanisms and processes through which ordinary citizens, particularly young people, women, and the poor, can give their views, express their complaints and ideas without fear. Obviously, jobs are very important, security very important, justice is very important, but none of them are sustainably achieved without voice. I come from Tunisia, and unfortunately there are too many countries, and my country before the revolution was one of them, where the space for civil society engagement has shrunk and continues to shrink, and where legitimate political dissent is criminalized. And it is the work of civil society that has brought my country away from the edge of the precipice on a number of occasions. So the second part, therefore, of the plan is use the implementation of the SDGs as a legitimate entry point, particularly for governments that are sensitive, that are worried about their sovereignty, that are afraid that you will be securitizing development in the search of peace. The third part of the plan is to activate a particular emergency mechanism when authorization for landing has not been granted. Actually, the authorization of overflight has not even been granted, let alone landing. And these are in situations where the country has all kind of clouds darkening its skies, and torrential rains are likely not only to flood the country but also the neighborhood. And that contingency plan is called Article 99 of the Charter. And Article 99 of the UN Charter allows the Secretary General to penetrate discreetly in the opaque skies under various face-saving governance and development guises to help prevent a particular situation from worsening. And she or he can do that without anybody knowing. And if you have interest in that, just read Dag Hammarskjöld, the biography. And the way Dag Hammarskjöld does it is by detailing the cost of inaction to a particular leader and what it means for his or her hold on power. And therefore, help him make the cost of conflict and the price of peace. The fourth part of the action plan is financing. Some predictable and sustaining finances to achieve this prevention mission. It is ironic that we'll always find billions for dealing with conflict after it has metastasized, but we always look for voluntary contribution when it comes to the central function of the United Nations, which is prevention. So a little bit of fun won't hurt. And in the case of using the Sustainable Development Goals, the funds are there. As you know, there is a big finance and conference that took place in Addis, and it's basically just addressing some of these fault lines, governance fault lines, as you try to develop a plan for implementing the SDGs. But I must admit, not all situations can be prevented. But I would wish to submit, even in situations that could not be prevented and a peacekeeping operation is sent, or a robust presence is sent, I would argue that some of these elements of a flight plan might be helpful. Even in situation where the urgency of stabilization is the priority, there are still some of these things that can be helpful to lay the foundation for self-sustainable peace. Thank you for suspending your judgment and letting me fly and imagine a possibility of early prevention.
Thanks very much. You were flying close to the sun of my time limit, but I think that you are a thought leader on this issue, and I think it's very important for us to put this in perspective. And as you say, the transformation now is coming from what used to be the aspiration of peace being defined negatively into more of what Immanuel Kant described as positive peace. Steve, Yusuf described you as a peace entrepreneur. I don't know if you've ever been called that before, but how do you sell the idea of peace, and how do you measure progress or the success of conflict prevention when nothing happens? This is a problem very often the High Commissioner has, that how do you prove that there was successful conflict prevention because nothing bad happened? I'd be interested to hear a bit about the work of your institute, which is very cutting edge, and some of the surveys that you do, and also now how your work is focused around SDG 16 and some of the things that Yusuf was just describing.
Right, okay. Is this working okay? Yes, it is, yeah. What I might do is I'm just going to start and talk about how you actually tackle and go about measuring peace. Then I'll come round and talk about positive peace, which is the attitudes, institutions and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. For me, that's not about prevention, it's about flourishing. And then I'll come round to the SDGs and some research we've just recently done, particularly on SDG 16. So I'll start actually with my own experience. So I got into peace accidentally. Set up a family foundation, spent 27 years working with the poorest of the poor through that. So that took us into a lot of conflict zones, near post-conflict zones. And one day I wondered what the most peaceful nations in the world were, did some searching on the internet and couldn't find anything. So that's how the Global Peace Index came about, purely accidentally. But what struck me at the time, if you can't measure something, can you actually really understand it? And if you can't measure something, do you know whether your actions are helping you or hindering you in achieving your goals? You don't, do you? You just don't. So, the first thing, if you want to measure peace, is you've got to understand the objective of what you're trying to achieve, because there are many, many different types of peace. So if we want to understand personal peace, it's very, very different than understanding the peace which comes from stopping conflict. So the Global Peace Index decided to look at a holistic set of peace from a country perspective. So 3 different domains which we measure in it. The first is safety and security. And that's things like the homicide rate, violent crime rate, number of people incarcerated in prison, size of the police forces, state-sponsored terror on its citizens. The second is militarisation, which we're all familiar with. And the third is ongoing conflict, which we're all familiar with. Now, we arrived at that through taking a definition of peace called the absence of violence or fear of violence. And that is a negative definition of peace. You could have called it a violence index, but the thing about calling it a peace index is the ongoing research you do out of it will be directed trying to understand simply through the name. So if it's a violent index, you'd be trying to understand what causes violence. A peace index, you now want to understand what causes peace. Very, very different outcomes. Analogy. So if we look at pathology, great breakthroughs. Probably no one in this room will die of a heart attack young. We're even curing cancer. So studying pathology is really important. But if we wanted to know how to stay healthy, active, alive, you wouldn't get that through studying someone on their deathbed. You'd study people who are really healthy. You'd find right exercise, good diet, correct mental disposition. You wouldn't hang around the divorce courts to have a good marriage. So, the study of peace is very, very different than the study of conflict. So what we did after developing the Global Peace Index, which is 23 measures, the domains I've just mentioned, we then did statistical analysis against 9,700 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys to find out what was most statistically associated with peaceful societies. Now, having done that, so we're totally empiric driven. None of my ideas, none of the researchers' ideas. Now, what we do from there is we now take the ones with the strongest statistical significance and turn them back into another index. And that index now has as its weighings the strength of the correlation. So again, we're moving away from a concept of this is what we think peace is to what the data can actually drive us to say. So this is quite profound. So it consists of 8 different domains, and those domains you can see as a topology or work as a system. And I'll spend about 1 minute on it in a couple of minutes. Now, positive peace, as we now do the statistical analysis on it, gives us predictions for methods for being able to assess future country risk, and I won't go into them now because we're short on time. You'll also find that countries which are high in positive peace between 1996 and 2013 had on average a 2% per annum higher GDP growth rate. You'll find that the inflation rates are lower. You'll find they perform better on measures of the different types of inclusion, including gender inclusion. Perform better on measures of ecological measures. Are more resilient to various types of systemic shocks, such as natural disasters, economic shocks, violent political turmoil, genocide. You'll also find that when you're looking at civil resistance movements, there's much less civil resistance movements. They exist for a short amount of time, more moderate in their aims and more likely to achieve their aims, and they're far less violence. So, as you start to look at positive peace, it starts to describe an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. Now, this is a system. It acts as a system. So the concept of causeless correlations is absolutely key, because the causality can run in either direction and can run from multiple angles. And so this is a different way of being able to actually look at the development. So sustainability and peace, or sustainable peace, which where you don't fall into violence, really now comes about to be conceived as a developmental agenda. So systems thinking, and we're starting to apply this conceptually into how a nation state operates, and there is very little work on it, but for everyone in this room, the operation of the nation state is paramount. Very little work on it. But it comes back to looking at not studying the events, but the flows. You have tipping points, like corruption and peace. GDP and peace has a tipping point as well. After a certain level of peace, or after a certain level of GDP growth, both go up tandem together. So you can't separate these things. Now, if we look at the sustainable, and I'll finish in about 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. So if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's an attempt by the international community to look at the development agenda going forward the next 15 years. Now, the first thing we need to do is understand it came about by negotiation, and an awful lot of negotiation at that. So, between the various 18 SDGs, there are 185 goals which are to be measured. Now, we've just, if we look at all those goals, what we did is took a positive peace and see out of those 185 measures how many applied to different ones. So the 2 which got the most focus is education and well-functioning government. Now, out of those 185, there's one goal, and that's inside goal 16, which actually focuses on corruption. One, okay? But corruption would, as most people in this room would see as being important. The other one, free flow of information, which could be epitomised by a free press, but it's a lot more, are 3 measures on that. So, although the Sustainable Development Goals is excellent moving forward, it does have some limitations, and I think we need to be aware of those in the way we approach it, particularly corruption, from the perspective, I imagine, of everyone in this room. We did an audit on Goal 16. We released the next GPI report next week in London, and in that we've got an audit of Goal 16. So we were interested to see how is it measurable today. So now if we take the 14 different measures in it, none of them can be 100% measured today. But for 40% of them, there are adequate measures to be able to actually measure progress. Now, if we look at the remaining goals, other than one, the others, you can actually get proxies to be able to determine if progress is being met. So goal 16 today is measurable. Now, not ideally, and with plenty of holes, but with enough there to be able to actually understand and see how it's going. Now, if we look at the SDGs, the official bodies which will feed into the UN for the official progress on these goals will come from the national statistical offices within the countries. However, if you look at the capabilities of these national statistical offices, they're meagre, to say the least. So as an international community, we need to look at other measures outside the national statistical offices to really be able to understand what happens and to be able to determine the veracity of the measurements coming out of the national statistical offices and to keep them accountable. I think I should stop there, Walter.
Great, thanks, Steve. And it's really exciting that, first of all, the peace and justice were included in the SDGs, but also that there are quantifiable ways of looking at this. It also strikes me that, as also Yusuf has referred to, we know what a fragile state looks like, but do we know what a peaceful state looks like? So this is the type of imagery that we should be looking at instead. And also I was thinking that we talk a lot about peacekeeping. Those are, in a way, the paramedics of the international system. What you're advocating is for more preventive medicine, which is much cheaper and would avoid the need for the paramedics to come in the future. Let's now hear from the High Commissioner on National Minorities, which, as I mentioned, is an institution, one of the few, that's dealing with conflict prevention. And I saw Astrid smiling when you were talking about education and participation, good governance. These are all the types of things that the High Commissioner does. Astrid.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I also may say the good cooperation with IPI. I actually visited your office some days after the famous resolution was adopted on 27th of April, which was also honey to my ears, and also the discussions we had with colleagues in DPA regarding exactly prevention and our experience on that. So it's very, in that way, I find that it's very useful and very interesting to discuss the common endeavors, and are there maybe some lessons learned from the experience of the High Commissioner? Let me say, of course, that my institution is not the only one who is dealing with prevention. I mean, this is the whole concept in the OSCE about the security, and also we have ongoing interesting work led by the German chairmanship now, where we have this chairmanship system, and they are going to have and have had some roundtables on the entire conflict cycle, including, for instance, on early warning. How should be that? That was also a good learning experience for me. But let me say, and Voltaire has of course rightly described some of the features of the High Commissioner, and I think I must start with that because I'm not a very well-known figure as such doing quiet diplomacy. We are always saying, and the English language is so fantastic because you can find so many compromises, this is the High Commissioner on national minorities, not for, taking a balanced approach, being a conflict prevention instrument, but the beauty of the institution being that where to engage, I don't need to resort to Article 99, but it is in the judgment of the High Commissioner. And this is the kind of beauty of the institution. The quiet diplomacy is then the other, let's say, side of the coin. But also that gives us, let's say, answers to some of the problems that have been discussed here, you know, how flexible and what is the question of resources. And to a certain extent, we have some resources that the High Commissioner and our office can use when we see that there is a situation that comes. So certain predictability of resources, and that is good to have in that way. When the mandate of the High Commissioner was phrased, it was two key words we have there, the early warning and the early action. And we can say that early warning, much is going on that work. The EU has been doing, our colleagues in the OSCE, but that has been kind of a bread and butter for the institution for a long time. And I would say that in comparison to other institutions working with early warning, we are also looking at what are the peace factors. And I think when we are doing early warning, we are also trying to be better at forecasting. What are the forecasts? Because what is the trigger factor in a certain situation? I think there we need we recognize we need to deepen our analysis and use all the tools that there are. And especially in discussions with colleagues in the OSCE and in discussions with other internationals, sometimes I realize that our view in the institution on early action is much earlier than others. It's really prevention. If an early warning is issued, then it's a kind of a failure. Then our early action has failed. My predecessor have, during the 23 years of existence, only issued two early warnings, one concerning the influx of refugees to Fyrom, as we say in the OSCE, and the other one was 2010 in Kyrgyzstan. So the really for early action. And there we could look at some of the, let's say, challenges for early action. I think that they have been mentioned previously in the discussion. How about building capacities for more resilience if the local actors are not so legitimate? It was mentioned in the first panel. Or if in reality, maybe some of the early actions might be exactly a danger for corrupt schemes, because we have more and more, I think, corrupt, let's say, state governance structure, and I think Europe and the USC area should not be sitting on any high horses or in any terms, because that is also spreading. So really the challenge to find the national, local actors that we are trying to support, because our early action is much targeting exactly the national, the local ownership. But sometimes we are not finding the right ones, and the right ones who would be ready, to go through checks and balances. I think lingering also in discussion is a second challenge, and that's the fear of stigmatization. That is. I mean, sometimes with the UN Special Rep against genocide, Mr. Deng, we are meeting quite often, and we're saying, look, is it you or I who am now more stigmatizing a country when we try to approach? So this is an area where we have much, sometimes very, very hard work, but here I think countries can lead by example, to help that. Third feeling from my side is that prevention, it must, exactly there, I also need the quiet diplomacy. But how about if we have more of geopolitics back, because preventative diplomacy needs to be backed by other international actors. And there is also more resistance to this let's say, influence in certain countries. I can say that even if I want to talk about lessons learned, but I think we can admit that for the High Commissioner, the previous 3 High Commissioners' most successful situations have been when there was a desire to get closer to EU integration, EU some association agreement. So the third thing, talking about the national self-interest. That's the third factor that we need to talk about. And all the instruments you are talking about are very, very, very important. But the factor that geopolitics is back is also, I can sometimes see that countries are forgiven some things which would go against good governance because it's in the geopolitical interest. I'm very, very Nordic and free and open in my discussions here. As I said, we have some flexibility in our rules. We have some donor, let's say, predictability in the resources. But we are a international organization. And we are also seeing more situations where our involvement would be needed, but maybe because of status questions. There are so many questions of status where it's difficult to go to work for an international organization. There we have, I think we have more and more, let's say, think tanks that are working. But my plea here to the international community would be, please take a long-term perspective, coordinate your activities when you support these organizations, because it can also be very, very difficult to give the same message and to work long-term perspectives. I have seen some of the let's say, adverse effects. And I think what has been mentioned earlier in the discussion also, it's not, we have been sometimes working with with policing in multi-ethnic societies, but a trend that is worrying, and that is that the monopoly of force, is it really restricted to the state authorities? Sometimes it can very, very much hurt the national minorities with which I work. I'm very concerned about that. If I said, the whole agenda of UN, the resolution that touched prevention was music to my eyes and ears in all the year. So has been, to a certain extent, the Sustainable Development Goals. But dear friends, the question, as we said, as you Walter said, tripling of interstate conflicts, very often related to ethnicities. But the word minority is not mentioned directly in the Sustainable Development Goals, because minorities is very, very political. And you can have on one side a situation where minorities are instrumentalized or are securitized. Seeing as a security, minorities were not mentioned. I know of several UN agencies that want to keep a distance to mentioning the word minority. And now the challenge is, because we know from many countries, we know from Myanmar, we know from Vietnam, those who have been left behind in the MDGs were exactly minorities. And how are we going to measure if we have exactly the statistical offices that are not that strong? And that there is not an agreement between the statistical offices how the data should be disaggregated. Yeah. There's not an agreement on that. Will we get the information about what is the situation of deprived minorities in the world? We have been working with so-called integration strategies in some OSCE participating states, meaning strategies that try to force a, let's say, common vision of the country. It's not only integrating minorities into the society, but really integrating the societies. You could also say kind of forming a civic identity. And one country I have been trying to encourage very much, okay, you have adopted, like in Georgia, a strategy for the integration of the country and interethnic relations. Please, when you are going to develop your implementation plans for SDGs, do them at the same time. Do them at the same time. That would be the perfect. And sometimes I feel that together with Secretary General of OSCE, Lamberto Sanier, and we are kind of these SDG persons inside OSCE, because I actually also see one forum which would be useful, and that would be that because SDGs need regional organizations to follow. And what would not be more natural that the OSCE parliamentarians would be following how the SDGs are implemented. So that would, you know, I want to use this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, because I see this is an instrument to have the better integration, and you have access to justice, they're mentioned. And let me say that when in this, we have, the institution has used, and you can find on the OSCE website, the thematic recommendations, the condensed experience we have been doing, and especially the two last ones, but the Ljubljana guidelines on integrating diverse societies. There you have some of the exactly key measures that are needed for an inclusive society. Everybody has been mentioning participation. Many of us have been mentioned access to justice. And the last one that was mentioned was education. Some peace agreements only have divided societies, so that instead of having a society where groups are interacting, we are having parallel societies. Some of the peace agreements. And when we celebrated this some weeks ago, looked with experts at how have these Hague recommendations on education established by my predecessor, the first Max van der Stoel, we looked at education should not be forgotten in peace agreements. It's quite often forgotten. Some rules should be looked in that, so that we can, let's say, at least try to avoid that we have a very divided future generation. Dear friends, maybe this was the practitioner's word, but the words came from the heart.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we have about half an hour, and I want to open it up to your questions. I have a question for each of the speakers, but you don't have to answer it now. Let's collect a few, but you can think about it as the other questions are coming in. Yusuf, how do you bring this issue of conflict prevention, or prevention more generally, into the mainstream of the UN's work now, particularly with the transition phase to a new UN Secretary General, and what would be different this time than before? The issue has been on the agenda before. Steve, you talk about the importance of collecting reliable statistics and promoting peace, but how do you do this in regions that are outside of the control of central governments? For example, in the Middle East or other places. And Astrid, is it an advantage or a disadvantage? You mentioned that there's no reference to national minorities in the Agenda 2030, but there's no definition of national minorities in your mandate. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage? For example, dealing with integration in the context of migration issues at the moment. So let's throw it open to the floor. If you could state your name and ask your question. Yes, sir.
My name is Willie Shawl, and I will be on one of the panels this afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Steve Kalila for his very refreshing thoughts and the ideas about positive peace. I think everybody who has been working in the field of peacekeeping, peace operations, this has been a unique opportunity to open a new, do away with our view on only on the negative sides.
Thank you.
One of the things I would be very interesting, also the link, because I'm coming also from the development side, that economic development and everything that goes with it, including education, is extremely necessary and points to these issues as being important in terms of a sustainable peace. Peace, as it's very often thought, absence of war, which is a very bad definition. But to be rather practical, I would like to ask, Steve, would you think, because we are talking about sequencing, prioritizing of priorities when you discuss with the government, would this be a helpful tool to guide also the UN programmatic activities? As the Commissioner was saying, we have a peace agreement and nowhere there's any word of how much effort and money and support should be dedicated to education, for example. You talk a lot about borders and this and sharing of natural resources. Nobody talks about education, for example. And following what you have been saying, obviously what you said, we pay a lot of attention to when the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater, when the conflict has happened, and it's human nature. Once you hit the wall, then you are open to suggestions, not before, but it actually shows that we should dedicate more of our intellectual and also political effort to the mediation in order to avoid these situations.
So advice on birth control instead of running orphanages, perhaps. The lady at the front here, Ms. Durham.
Thank you. Helen Durham from the International Committee of Red Cross. Thank you, panellists. I think it's a really important issue. And I was wondering if you would have some advice on how we can have a more intelligent discourse on prevention in the humanitarian sector. I'm constantly trying to engage, whether it be with donors or with governments or even within my own institution, the importance of prevention. When the assistance, it's much easier to show and have on a front page the assistance activities, the creation of hospitals, the delivery of aid, where if we're trying to actually make sure that we strengthen the understanding of not to commit atrocities, to try and prove the negative and to demonstrate the outcomes rather than the outputs is difficult. And I'm wondering, I think we need a more sophisticated discourse about prevention within the humanitarian sector and how we can explain it to donors, if I may put it in a very practical sense.
If I can just add to that, how do you get the attention of political leaders who are so focused on the crises of the day to focus on something which might be beyond their political cycle, but in terms of prevention? Last question in this round, Ambassador, we'll take two more.
My name is Philip McDonough. I'm the Irish ambassador at the OSCE. I'd just like to raise two general issues, timelines and regions. The Sustainable Development Goals, in which Ireland played a role in New York, they are related to Agenda 2030, so there's a timeline. But not all concepts of this kind have timelines, and is that an important factor? And then my other question is about regions. The High Commissioner on National Minorities mentioned the OSCE and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly as being a possible vehicle at a regional level. But sometimes we find it hard to identify what is the system which we need to identify in order to help our situation. And Steve and the Institute for Economics and Peace talks in a very creative way about systems and how we have to look beyond the local cause to some wider reality. But, for example, is the Middle East potentially a system? And do we see within the OSCE region a single system, or are there different systems? Or should we look at the whole global reality as a system? How do we define the system within which we're going to look for these factors of positive peace?
Great. Last question to Michael Doyle in this round, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Again, I'd like to thank all of the presenters for those truly enlightening remarks ranging from theory to practice. I thought they were quite illuminating, and it's a very important agenda. I've got a question particularly for Commissioner Torres, which is that the record of success of your office over a long period of time is one of the most often cited examples for preventive action, beginning, I guess, with the first commissioner, Mr. van der Stoel. And when people say, give us examples of successful prevention, his name, in my view, is the one that, in my memory, is the one that always comes up. So the successes are well known. Could you reflect a little bit on some of the problems or the failures, if they might be posed that way? That is, was your office, your predecessor, mobilized with regard to Crimea and Ukraine, and so it was on the radar screen and there were actions? Or was it an unpredicted and incident that could not be addressed? I mean, how does one account for the fact that, unfortunately, the Ukrainians have experienced the opposite of good prevention in what's happened there? And what could we say about that?
Great. A lot of meaty questions just before lunch. So let's start with Yusuf.
I think I'll start with your question about how to integrate prevention in the mainstream. It's very difficult for three reasons. One, whenever you talk about peace or development, security is not far behind. Unfortunately, most of the problems and the solutions are looked at from a security point of view, and therefore there is a mistrust among member states. What's behind this positive peace business here? Is it another little trick to securitize development? So the first thing we need to do is to cleanse it, to reframe conceptually what positive peace means. Not just peace, but positive peace. So reframing is the concept is very important. Second is to be practical, to provide practical examples of what governments and national actors can do, and they are doing. And there are plenty of examples. In other words, showcasing what positive peace looks like. I'll just give you one example that was given to me by the Perm Rep of Ghana. They have a lot of, like many other countries, issue with youth and employment. And they have used private-public partnership with Guinness, the beer maker. As you know, Guinness, for those who, they use malt and, and barley that Ghana does not produce. So they've challenged this business to make beer out of cassava, which is this root. And they say, what? It's like a heresy. But lo and behold, there is, I will spare you the long discussion. Beer is made in from cassava in Ghana. And the impact it has on agriculture, on youth employment, on technology, on entrepreneurship that is positive peace. So in other words, you have to practically demonstrate what it would look like to have positive peace. The question on the humanitarian, and as you know, the first goal of the humanitarian summit is prevention. It's easy to state. It's very difficult to push, particularly these days, as the commissioner had said, the geopolitics, unfortunately, is rearing its ugly head, except it's like a python with multiple heads this time. And we are caught in this new cycle of the weapon of mass migration. And it has skewed some of the good arguments that have worked before. And it's largely linked to solutions rather than preventions, particularly as more and more people introvert. They think that by raising the barrier, they won't have to pay the cost of preventing it. It's always So unfortunately, the humanitarian field, the wind is not blowing in the direction of prevention, as you have heard from the discussion in Istanbul. And guess who has attended that? If you look at the videos, who's attended the various sessions on prevention? Maybe I'll stop here and I can come back to other.
Okay. Difficult stacks are very, very difficult to get. Okay, and that's just a fact. So if you move into conflict zones, getting accurate statistics is very, very hard. But there's ways of being able to do statistical techniques for when you've got gaps in big data sets to be able to estimate what that would be. And that's based around looking at the similar like countries for which you can get a stat, and then overlaying one or two other dimensions which might be affecting that stat to come up with an approximation of what that should be. So in things like the Global Peace Index, we use the mechanisms of quantitative data and qualitative data, with the qualitative data estimated by authoritative groups, so we can offset where the quantitative data may be incorrect. And then we go for the best sources we've got. So if we're going for homicides or violent crime, we go to places like UNODC. If we're looking for arms imports, exports, we go to CIPRI. I think battlefield desks, we go to IISS. So we generally go to the sources where there's the very, very best data. But what I want to do is just talk about fuzziness, okay? So it's one thing to be totally blacked out, okay? And if you haven't got any measures, let's say you're totally blacked out. So getting some light in the room, even though your vision is going to be very, very fuzzy, is better than no light at all. So complex indexes, really good indexes, are trying to reflect really sophisticated and complex phenomena, and you'll never get them accurately, okay? It's just an impossibility. So therefore, having some light, understanding some of the limitations, because they'll be specific and for specific countries, it's better than having no light at all. So with 185 SDGs, it's very, very hard to know which ones to focus on. And the problem is most countries will be able to cherry pick which ones they want and why that'll be an advantage. One of the things I think is for the international community, somehow have to get an organised and coherent voice to say these are the 15 measures which are absolutely vital, and then a lot of the other measures will just flow out of it. So I think some shape, way and form, there's a need for that, because we run the risk over the next 15 years of everything being fragmented and people saying, well, this is our national priority, these are the 27 measures in the SDG, we'll focus on them and ignore the others. And you'll see, and that'll be particularly true with the focus on education and well-functioning government, but only aspects of well-functioning government. Timelines are important. Now, when looking at the development of positive peace, it happens over a lengthy period of time. Occasionally you get countries advancing quickly. Myanmar or Burma would be a big example at the moment. I think Georgia recently has been through that as well, but I'm not clear on that. But it advances slowly, where peace can drop dramatically and increase quite dramatically, or not dramatically, but reasonably over a few years of time. And so that gets back into how do you get a more intelligent discourse, because a lot of the discourse we find is driven by, in the West anyway, between the relationship between the media and short-term politics. And that's a very, very difficult question. And I'm afraid I haven't got a clear answer for that, other than there's a need to be able to separate long-term planning and globally from domestic short-term things which are happening with any domain. I'm just going to comment just a little bit on risk, on systems thinking, and then stop. Just a quick comment on country risk. I'll do the country risk first. So what we've got is we've got mechanisms for being able to estimate country risk, and they're different models for looking for different falls in peace. And a lot of this comes back again to looking at it from a systemic view. So we've got a paper we're releasing in 6 weeks which looks at risk using a systemic approach, and we can take a group of countries, 15 to 20, because you need a manageable number of countries, and do projections 2 to 5 years out to determine the likelihood of a substantial drop in peace. And we're getting a 53 to 57% accuracy rate off that. Now, if you went to the OECD, the World Bank, they're getting 23 to about 25% accuracy when they're looking at the list of countries which might fall. So that's one technique. So what happens when you can quantify a thing, you look at the theoretical piece, which is positive piece, the actual piece, which is the GPI, you do all sorts of interesting calculations then on probabilities. The other one is when we look at countries where the actual piece is much higher than the theoretical piece, positive piece. We went back to 2008, ran the analysis through to 2015, and there were 30 countries in that bracket. Of those 30 countries, 22 dropped in peace, 4 stayed the same, and 4 increased. Now that model's not looking for substantial drops increase, small drops increase. So you've got different models when you're looking for different outcomes. Most people are looking for big drops. The little drops are of more interest to us because that's showing and it's sustained over time because that's showing the movement of a system. So I'm just going to, one last thing, okay? Systems thinking, when you're applying it, and it's applied in our framework through positive peace, is a profoundly different way of looking at things. So I'm this is the most interesting thing I've learned in the last 2 years. So now, if you think of causality, we live in a causal world. The physical world operates off it. The whole modern empiric science comes from it. Computers come out of it. Now, the effect lies in the cause. So if I pick that glass up, throw it at the wall, the effect lies in the momentum transferring from arm into the glass. Subconsciously, we all operate because we understand this cause and effect. It's how we can catch a ball. It's how we can cut our food over dinner. It's built into our subconscious. So we're always looking for a cause. Now, so I'm talking here in the room. I'm catching the eyesight of these 2 gentlemen here and the lady over there with the great accent. And as I'm delivering this information, the 3 of you will take it and act or not act, depending on your background information, what you might think of me, even your moods on the day. So, and I'm altering what I'm saying by looking at the audience and looking at the 3 of you and the way you're taking information. So this is a mutual feedback loop, and it's not causal. It's not causal. Now, this is just conversation here. Imagine that extrapolated up through society. So what we've got to look is at flows, relationships, tipping points, rather than events. Because it's the velocity or movement of the system which counts. Is it slowly improving, which we call a virtuous cycle, or is it slowly decaying, which we call a vicious cycle? So quite often the trajectory and movement is important. Now, there's a lot, there can go into a lot of detail, but just one last thing. So systems, biological systems have intent. Now, everyone in this room, I'd assume, thinks they have intent. Intent on doing things. Certainly eating, otherwise we starve. So now, if we're looking at the nation state as a system, what is the intent of the nations of the world? I don't even know of any measurement on it. So how do you and that is a good starting point if you want to start looking the the dynamics of global relations. So we're looking at how can you take a national intent and understand it. So 4 dimensions you can measure it on. First is international relations. The second is the type of political system. The third is the economic system. And the fourth is the social system. So now, this stuff can get a lot more complicated, but when you're looking at countries, yes, you can take positive peace, and you can use that as a framework to understand, better understand what's happening within societies and what should be done. But one needs to think that this is a process which goes over quite a lengthy period of time. I'll stop there.
Astrid?
First, your question, whether it's an advantage or disadvantage, the national minorities are not defined in my mandate, and so are they in very, very few other places. I think it's good reflection of reality. I know that many people think it is only ethnic minorities, but sorry, what is ethnicity? And haven't we overemphasized ethnicity? Secondly, I once spoke to a person who had been working in as a priest in the former Soviet Union, and he told me, Astrid, the 2 last things a person gave up under oppression. The second last was the language, and the last thing was the religion. So it's also explicitly mentioned in my mandate that I am to listen to religious leaders, and I think I experience a situation where there's more, let's say, religious minority, ethnic minority, they are coming together, and with all this work relating to oppression or to foreign fighters, I think the religious factor is becoming more and more important in all areas where we work. I have also seen that in some of the other organizations, like in Council of Europe, they have been at the Parliamentary Assembly, they try to define something, but sorry, traditional national minorities, what is that? Mm-hmm. How is it, and how long are you an immigrant? 3rd generation, 4th generation. Mm. We are working very much with people having multiple identities, because that is the reality today. And also, I think mutatis mutandis, as they say, our experience of handling diversity can be used in many of the societies now wanting to improve their integration policies after the so-called migration crisis. So I see more advantages than disadvantages. That doesn't say that it's easy for us to get the understanding of participating state that we should work with the newest groups. Successes and failures of the High Commissioner. Typically, we have many countries who adherent to the European Union are looked upon as successes, but also once upon a time, Crimea, the autonomy for that was one area where Max von der Stoel was very much engaged in. So, as has been looked, there was the report that you know very well, Walter, when also the last year on lessons learned from Ukraine crisis in the OSCE. We could see that one of the, let's say, challenges was exactly if you are working with a country that happens to be the chairman in office. That is a little bit of a challenge. And I think there were many, and including in our office, who saw that something could be coming. But what is the challenge in that situation was the speed with which things happened. If compared to when there was, let's say, change in government in Kiev, and how soon things happened on the ground in Crimea, I think that was the challenge. We didn't issue a formal early warning, but at least we saw that there were some decisions taken in the Verkhovna Rada in Ukraine that would exactly also be used for then something that happened later, the abolishment of the language law that was portrayed, leading to a worse position for the Russian language. That was, we issued an alert, but I think that let's say if you would only talk about early warning and early action as OSCE as such, I mean, it was the speed with which it happened, and may also, to some extent, how things can spiral very quickly in the social media. that's also a new challenge for us.
Okay, we've reached the end of our time, and I don't want to prevent you from eating lunch, so I want to wrap it up there. But just to address Helen Durham of the ICRC's question about how do we have this conversation, Yusuf and I have been talking about starting a dialogue process on the issue of prevention, both in New York but also in Vienna. And I think you could say that we've had that first conversation here today. And I see a lot of great opportunities for partnership with the High Commissioner's Office, with the IEP, that we continue moving this forward. So as I've mentioned in my opening remarks, we don't see the Vienna seminar as just one opportunity for talking about issues of international peace and security. I could see a concrete follow-up of this meeting to continue our discussion on prevention. So if you could join me in thanking the panelists for a very substantive discussion, very inspiring, and hopefully we can build on this in the future. Thanks very much.
Sure.